it's just their personality. They're a bit obsessive or whatever. But we do know through research, but primarily by Tom and Roger, that Lawrence Suid did have paid contracts with the Department of Defense at various points in his career. I think it was a couple of them, and I can't remember the extent of the work, but he worked extremely closely with them, and some of the time he was at least he was paid for that. So I think that there was a kind of I don't think it was ever that they were that I don't think it was necessarily them saying, we want to keep all of this material away from the public, make sure you do that. But I think perhaps it was a kind of understanding that that this was working out well for everybody. Is this just a personality glitch of Lawrence Suid, that he was a bit peculiar like that? Is it that he really was working on that material and he really did need it? I'm pretty cynical about that. I mean, I certainly think that in terms of, would he need all documentation in an archive at all points? It just seems highly unlikely. He was extremely uncooperative. You could photocopy something if you need to. And it is indicative that the archive started just to open up a year before his death. And that's when I went to Washington, D.C., to Georgetown University Library. And I found the less controversial documentation had then been set out there. And so I was able to find a few bits and pieces out. It was kind of worth the flight, maybe not. But it was still a good trip. But then a year later, when Lawrence Suid died, Roger Stahl also then went to Georgetown University, and he found he found the other half, basically, the much juicier and the much more annotated and the scripts and many more memos and a lot more details and a lot of the more sexy films, the James Bond films and I think the Hulk films and the Marvels and all of that. And so he was able to find a lot more then. I think there must have been something that the relationship between the library and Lawrence Suid, without sort of besmirching the library, I just think it's fair to say that relationship was significant in terms of what was able to come out. And I think perhaps the library was complicit there in not being terribly open with that documentation.
Yeah. I mean, you don't, this is also getting into speculation, but do you think that says, that whole Lawrence Suid and the library story says anything about maybe academia more broadly? Is academia, I mean, you've been in that. Is academia part of the problem here as well, in terms of their pliability to power?
The short answer to that is I think definitely yes. In fact, you mentioned at the top of this show about the book that I did with TJ Cole's Union Jack book, what your professors won't tell you about foreign policy. I actually, I always slightly think we shouldn't have said professors. I think that was TJ Cole's. I thought we should say teachers, because I thought we were talking more about, kind of the whole schooling system. But actually, I find myself slightly less uncomfortable with that title, because universities are part of the problem, actually. I mean, I think we published that book about 5 years ago, and actually, I mean, I did feel that when I went to Georgetown University, that they were part of something that wasn't terribly healthy for the dissemination of knowledge. And I mean, that there are quite a few decent books out there about this, like The Coddling of the American Mind and various others that are that indicate that university systems are not very good. But I mean, and I can't remember that literature particularly well myself. I'm more coming from the Noam Chomsky perspective, and when Chomsky talks about the de-radicalization, the declawing of discourse. I mean, everyone associates him with the media, and everyone thinks that he's talking about the New York Times and the Washington Post and and all that. But Chomsky has been always much wider than that. He's been referring to the responsibility of intellectuals. That was his first major published article in 1967, the responsibility of intellectuals. And he says that they're not being responsible at all. And so I think that there is an overall problem within academia and across society, and particularly amongst elite society, where they are serving the interests of powerful political and corporate entities, and are not comfortable or interested in, things like the peace movement, but also other things that are usually connected with the left. So I do think that there is a broader problem there, and I think that this does point to that. In fact, and again, sorry to continue with my ramble, but for the way of characterizing the film, I was encouraging more of that for the documentary, because I think perhaps because Roger's a very successful academic. However, the people who, the other people around him, and the other people who have pioneered this story over the past 15, 20 years, have been oddballs. They haven't been academics. They haven't been the professors of whatever. There's been me, a part-time teacher, and whatever else I do. There's been Tom Secker, who I don't even know what job he does, but I think for a while he worked maybe part-time for a local charity or something. He hasn't done any academic work. There was David Robb, who did that first relatively sort of short book where he kind of opened up that field, who was a kind of renegade freelance journalist who I met in LA a few years ago. And he just was sort of like, he was kind of chain smoking with his trousers half done up. And, so all the people who have tended to characterize this field have been, we've been on the fringes. We've not been a sort of mainstream academia, I wouldn't say at all. So I think there was perhaps differences between my perspective on that and say what Roger Stahl was, his perspective. But he sort of thought, well, we're kind of all doing stuff, and we're all academics, and we're all kind of academia is working here. It's making truth come to light. And we're analyzing stuff over time. And I was like, this isn't a story of academic success. This is a story of massive structural academic failure over 4 decades at least. But maybe that wasn't a very popular way of putting it.
Well, yeah, it's easy for Roger to say, I guess. Yeah, I mean, me being in academia, I have come to the sense that the university system has always been deeply intertwined with the national security state for the since the Cold War, and even if a lot of academics like to play the radical, perform radicalism, it's what they're doing usually isn't that dangerous to power.